Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for joining us. Professor Marik, thank you very much, sir, for giving us your precious time. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for introducing us and for getting Dr. Marik to talk to us. I'm going to hand over to you, Paul, to take it on. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And Paul, welcome. We are very thrilled to have you here with us. It's been a fantastic opportunity for us to hear firsthand something of the saga and your own saga about the issues around ivermectin. Just for briefing, just if I could shortly just say that Paul and Professor Corey together researched, pioneered, and most importantly publicized the use of ivermectin, which is a repurposed anti-parasitic drug used mainly in animals, together with other safe and freely available substances to assist in the treatment and amelioration and perhaps even preventing COVID infections. They have written about it, been interviewed about it, and published, and even appeared at a congressional hearing to report on just how successful their management of serious COVID infection had been. Initially, they were ignored, then poo-pooed, but now they are being taken much more seriously, and many trials using their protocols are in process. In South Africa, ivermectin has just been approved for compassionate use under medical supervision. But more importantly, that from my perspective, is that Paul is an extremely and a brave person, because he's tackled the whole world with what he believes is an important discovery in being able to manage this disease. He's tackled it against, with opposition from the pharmaceutical, big pharma, academic institutions, and he's carried on publishing, doing what he's done, reviewing literature that appears in journals and elsewhere. And he's taken, he and Professor Corey have taken almost single-handedly taken on the responsibility for at least getting people to look at ivermectin very seriously. And so, Paul, we are very grateful to have you here, and we are so looking forward to your presentation, if I may hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for those kind words. I think, Solly, you have to allow me to share my screen, because I can't share the screen. It says host is disabled participant screen sharing.
No,
so I think
I've got it. I've got it on there. It should be okay now.
Okay, there we go. So I have to find my screen. Hold on. Oh my goodness. Hold on a second.
While Paul is searching to, he is known in our correspondence as Paul the Younger. I'm known as Paul the Elder, much like Pliny. So Paul the Younger, are you on?
Okay, so I don't know, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know why it was being a bit stupid. There we go. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's good. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. So what I'm going to do is, give you a brief overview on our Math Plus and IMAS protocol, how we got there, and then really open it up for questions, because I think probably that's the most important part of our discussion. So as you know, the virus is a respiratory pathogen. It spreads by droplets and aerosols. It replicates in the nasopharynx, and it's particularly adapted to replicating thousands and millions of times in the upper respiratory tract. And that's why it's so infectious. So this slide compares SARS-CoV-2 in blue to MERS and SARS-CoV. And what you can see, firstly, so on this axis is the viral load. So unlike the other two diseases, this virus replicates to very high concentrations in the nasopharynx. And what makes it such a pathogenic virus is that its viral load is highest before onset of symptoms. So it's these asymptomatic people or people in the early symptomatic phase that have enormously high levels of viral load and actually spread the virus. And you don't need to cough or sneeze, just breathing exhales millions of particles of virus. So this is why it's so infectious. And this is why, you know, public health measures are so important. The worst thing is large group of people spread the virus. So the next point, and this is such an important point, and I don't think doctors recognize this. And it's absolutely critical to understanding the management of COVID. And if doctors don't understand it, how the heck can they treat it? So what happens with COVID is it goes through a number of phases. So we have the incubation period where the virus replicates in the upper airway, as we said, and it reaches the highest viral loads just before the onset of symptoms. So these are when the patients are most symptomatic. About 20 to 30% of people remain asymptomatic. They don't go and develop symptoms. And it seems that younger people particularly are more prone to not to get symptoms. Then there's a percentage of people, you know, 60 to 70% of people that go into the symptomatic phase. So this is marked by fever, malaise, cough, headache, diarrhea. So the virus does infect, apart from infecting the lung, infects the small bowel. So people get diarrhea. Elderly people may just present with confusion. So if you have an elderly person you know who becomes confused for no good reason, there's a possibility that they may have COVID. So it presents in a diverse way. Now, what happens then is, as you see during the symptomatic phase, the virus stops replicating. And then most people will recover, but about 10 to 20% of people will then progress to the pulmonary phase. The pulmonary phase is marked by shortness of breath. So this is where people get lung findings. So they become short of breath and their oxygen levels in their blood go down. But what's important to recognize that the lung findings is not due to the virus. So autopsy studies have clearly demonstrated that it's not the virus that's killing the host or damaging the lung. It's the host's response to the dead virus. So what happens is it's a very complicated disease, which we're just beginning to understand. You get this profound immunological dysfunction and results in this profound inflammatory response. And it's inflammation to dead virus. And this becomes important, as you'll see, because the treatment depends upon, is this due to viral replication or is this due to the immune phase? And then as patients progress from the early to the late phase, the immune dysfunction gets more severe. And this becomes important because you get to a point where it's very difficult to reverse. So you want to get people in the early pulmonary phase. Once they reach the late pulmonary phase, it is largely an irreversible disease. So again, this just shows this in a different way, looking at laboratory tests. So the PCR is the test for the PCR test for looking for viral antigen. So it's important to realize the PCR test does not test for live virus. It looks for viral RNA. So you can see that, again, this is the virus replicating, reaches a peak just before the onset of symptoms. This is when the patient's infectious. So patients are usually infectious for about 5 days after symptoms. Then the virus disappears. And the virus disappearing is at the same time that the body mounts an immune response and you develop antibodies. So antibodies develop in the second week. So you can see this is the native pharyngeal swab PCR. So the PCR stays positive long after the virus is no longer replicating. And this is really an important concept, because the fact that you are PCR positive does not mean you're infectious and can spread the virus. The other thing which is important is that not everyone who gets SARS-CoV-2 becomes PCR positive. So it used to be about 80%. So only about 80% of people who actually develop antibodies or develop COVID are PCR positive. Now with these new variants, it may be even less. So it does raise questions about the value of the PCR. So we consider COVID a clinical disease. People who develop features compatible with COVID have COVID until proven otherwise. So again, this is going through the symptoms, which are pretty characteristic in the different phases in the time period. So this is fever. So the top is people who survive. The bottom hatched is people who die. So the fever lasts quite a long time, 10 days. Cough, again, this lasts quite some time, 16 days. So you can see that people have the symptomatic phase, and sometimes they get better. So by the 5th or 6th day, it appears they're getting better. Then day 7 and 8 is when they start developing the pulmonary signs. So this is really important. So they've gone from the symptomatic phase to the pulmonary phase. And this is day 7 and 8. Then patients obviously progress, their lung symptoms get worse, they go to ICU and they die. So part of the message is that you don't, once you start developing pulmonary symptoms, that's when you need to go to hospital and be treated aggressively, because the further the disease progresses, the more difficult it is to reverse. So I'm briefly going to talk about the management of COVID. Obviously, it's complicated for multiple reasons, primarily because of politics. And there's lots of sinister things going on, which has really changed the narrative. So what I have on this slide is a list of drugs that have been tested. We have the different phases, pre, post exposure, the symptomatic phase, and the pulmonary phase. And then I have color-coded. Green are drugs that are benefit, red are drugs that are harmful, and orange or yellow is maybe, maybe not. So although there was a lot of talk about hydroxychloroquine, actually it's a very ineffective drug, and it's maybe harmful in the late phase, is probably of no benefit in the early phase. So I think we can throw hydroxychloroquine away. Although there are some people who believe it, it becomes like a religious thing. I think the overwhelming burden of data suggests hydroxychloroquine is ineffective. We then have remdesivir, which is an antiviral. So, and we'll see this is one of the drugs approved by the NIH. The symptomatic phase is no benefit. What we do know is that it does tend to decrease time to recovery in the early pulmonary phase, but really is of no mortality benefit, and really is a drug which is somewhat ineffective. But obviously there are enormous financial pressures to use this drug. So these are the lopinavir. Ritonavir is a HIV drug which was shown to be of no benefit. Interferon seems to be harmful when given late, maybe of benefit. Tocilizumab is a monoclonal antibody against one of the cytokines, appears of no benefit. And then convalescent serum. So there was a lot of attention given to convalescent serum. So you would take plasma from people that were infected and you would inject it into people with COVID. We now know absolutely, categorically, and definitively that it doesn't work. There is one exception. that in patients who have leukemias and lymphomas, it may work. But in the general population, convalescent serum does not work. Monoclonal antibodies, for the same reason, do not work. And the whole concept of giving antibodies doesn't really make sense, because this is not Ebola. This is not a blood-borne infection. This is in the lung and nasopharynx. And antibodies are big proteins, and it's somewhat mysteriously how people think they can get to where you want them to work. Steroids, so as we said, the pulmonary phase is marked by severe inflammation. Corticosteroids are the most potent anti-inflammatory drugs we know. So therefore, they are a benefit in the pulmonary phase. But if you give them in the symptomatic phase, when the virus is replicating, it tends to do harm. Ivermectin, which is truly has appeared as an astonishing drug, is a benefit in all 3 phases of the disease. So, I think this is a very important table. So this is based on the best available scientific data. It's there. And, it's clear. But obviously, there are lots of political forces at play that do not want people to see this table or understand this table, primarily because the expensive drugs, which are made by big pharma, just don't work. Whereas you have a cheap drug, which we'll come to, that seems beneficial. So again, if we combine the phases of the disease with the different modes of therapy, you can see it becomes very phase specific, that you want to use an antiviral drug when the virus is replicating. It's just common sense. So to give remdesivir, which is an antiviral, in this phase is completely stupid. Likewise, you don't want to give potent anti-inflammatory drugs during the phase of viral replication. So you can see that our Math Plus and IMAS protocol are really based on this concept of phase-specific treatment. It just so happens that ivermectin works across the board. And then we come again with zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D, and melatonin, which probably have a role through both phases, all the phases. So there is something called the NIH, and it's a pity there is something called the NIH, because the rest of the world looks at the NIH as the source of all truth. And, when we say something, people say, well, that's not what the NIH says, so you think you know better. So unfortunately, the NIH has become the arbiter of the truth, and almost every nation in the world looks at the NIH for guidance. Unfortunately, the NIH is strongly influenced by big pharma. I don't think it's any secret. So if you look at the NIH guidelines for non-hospitalized patients, they make no recommendations. So you just stay at home until you get sick and die. For hospitalized patients, no treatment. So what they recommend is, if you hospitalize in an oxygen, remdesivir. So remdesivir costs in the US about $3,000 a course, a really marginal benefit. And then in the more severe patients, dexamethasone. So this is what the NIH recommends. And unfortunately, countries across the world think this is gospel. So furthermore, this is their recommendations. They recommend against hydroxychloroquine. They recommend against ritonavir, lopinavir. In terms of ivermectin, so we actually had an interview with the NIH because they had an absurd recommendation recommending against, based on no real good data. It was just opinion and they couldn't explain it. We then presented to them and they changed from against to insufficient data to recommend either for or against. We actually know that they never took this to a vote. We're not sure how they came to this conclusion. We know that it's spurious and not based on the data, but it is the NIH. So again, convalescent plasma, although we know it doesn't work, We know it doesn't work. They can't make a recommendation. And vitamin C and vitamin D, again, they can't make a recommendation either for or against, which is truly astonishing because this is an interview with Dr. Fauci, who's regarded as, Moses of COVID. And he said that there are 2 vitamins that Fauci does take. So he said, I would not mind recommending, and I do take it myself, vitamin D. So Dr. Fauci takes vitamin D, he takes vitamin C, but the NIH will not make a recommendation for vitamin D. And in fact, there's overwhelming data that vitamin D deficiency increases your risk of getting COVID and of dying of COVID. And there's good data, if you take vitamin D, it reduces your risk of dying. I mean, vitamin D is the most politically neutral drug there can possibly be. No one has a vested interest. It's cheap, it's safe. And so why there is this enormous reluctance is truly astonishing. And, COVID has hit people of minorities the most significantly. So we know people of color do not make vitamin D in adequate amounts, so they particularly at risk of vitamin D insufficiency. We know elderly people don't make vitamin D in their skin. We know obese people. So there's no question that people at risk should be given vitamin D. It's just such a non-brainer. So how do we develop our math protocol? So we had originally developed the HAT protocol for septic shock. And as I've explained, there's enormous overlap between sepsis and COVID pneumonia with this profound immune dysregulation. So COVID pneumonia really is caused by severe immune dysregulation. And really that's how we came up with the Math Plus protocol. So you just to summarize it briefly, because you can go to our website where there's much more information. So I should say this, that if you go to our website, flccc.net, flccc.net, it has copies of all our protocols and the rationale behind it. So the Math Plus is what we originally started with because, we were ICU doctors and this is what we were facing. So this was the hospital treatment. So this consists of methylprednisolone, which is a potent steroid, ascorbic acid, thiamine, and heparin. So that was the Math Plus protocol. But it soon became obvious that Math Plus, while it would reduce the risk of hospital death, was not going to have a big impact. We really needed to focus much earlier in the disease, in prophylaxis and early treatment. So the goal should be to prophylax in those who you can, and those people who have COVID, to treat them early rather than waiting for them to progress. So this is the common situation in the US. So and maybe across the world, most people, doctors, don't know about prophylaxis and early treatment. And it seems obvious that you want to treat a disease early rather than wait for it to progress. And this is what we get. These are the emails we get day in and day out. My doctor told me there was absolutely nothing she could prescribe for me, and that if my lips turned blue or I could not breathe, to go to the emergency room. So this is in the United States of America, where we supposedly have the best healthcare system in the world. Patients are being told to stay at home until they cannot breathe and go blue, and then go to the hospital. This is astonishing and just not acceptable. And indeed, the NIH supports such an approach. They make no recommendations for post-exposure prophylaxis, pre-exposure prophylaxis, or early treatment. So then we came up with the IMASC protocol. So it consists of a prophylactic protocol and an early out treatment. So the prophylaxis protocol, we recommend ivermectin in high-risk individuals, so most notably healthcare workers who haven't been vaccinated, people in long-term care facilities who are at enormously high risk of getting COVID, and family exposure. We know that if one person in a close-knit family has COVID, the likelihood is that half of the people in a family will get COVID. And we often see on TV both the husband and wife, unfortunately, passing from COVID. We know definitively that if you prophylax these people with ivermectin, you can reduce their risk from about 50% to about 5%. So it's very effective in prophylaxis. In addition, we recommend people take vitamin D, vitamin C, quercetin or plant flavonoids, zinc, and melatonin. So these are really simple things people can do to improve their immune response and to prevent them getting COVID. So there is actually a randomized controlled trial in healthcare workers showing the combination of vitamin C and quercetin significantly reduces the risk of getting COVID. So it kind of should be obvious that, there's no single magic bullet. This is a vicious disease, and you need multiple drugs with multiple modes of action to be effective. What's most important is the early outpatient protocol. So, someone who develops signs and symptoms of COVID, they should be treated immediately, even before the test comes back positive. It's really important for two reasons. Firstly, if you treat them, it prevents them spreading the disease. So ivermectin is a potent anti-inflammatory drug. So it prevents them spreading the disease. Also, most importantly, it decreases progression of the disease. So we know if you treat people early, it decreases the time to viral clearance and improves symptoms. And then we add vitamin D, vitamin C, quercetin, zinc, melatonin, and we add aspirin. So these are simple over-the-counter medications. I'm not sure if melatonin's available in South Africa. It's certainly available over-the-counter in the US. These are readily available, very cheap. Melatonin is somewhat interesting. People think that, we Looney Tunes, but it just so happens that bats, who are the natural reservoir of coronaviruses, have higher levels of melatonin than any other species. And it's been postulated that it's the really high melatonin levels that prevents the bats becoming symptomatic. So that's the theory, but there are now two really good clinical trials, one from Cleveland Clinic showing that people who take melatonin have a significantly reduced risk of getting COVID. And more recently, a study out of New York showing that patients in the ICU who were getting melatonin had a significantly reduced risk of dying. So again, this very simple, cheap drug, which is exceedingly safe, has important clinical impact. So we should turn to ivermectin. So William Campbell and Satoshi Omura actually won the Nobel Prize for discovering ivermectin. So they discovered this in 1975 in cultures, and they got the Nobel Prize. It was first used in humans in 1987. So this is really important, and it is astonishing that South Africa banned this drug, which has been used in humans since 1987. As we'll see, 3.7 billion doses have been given to 3.7 billion people. So this is a people drug. It's also used in veterinary medicine, but this is given to humans. What it does, it's an antiparasitic. It paralyzes the parasite, and the parasite gets excreted. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. So it's astonishing to me that any country would ban a drug which is recognized to be safe and effective and on the WHO list of essential medications. The WHO recognized the importance of this drug, which has had a major impact in controlling parasitic diseases. It has broad spectrum antiparasitic, but interesting antiviral activity. And just to put the cherry on the top, to make it so potent for COVID, it has potent anti-inflammatory and immune modulating properties. So that's why it's useful in all the stages of the disease. In the early phases, it's antiviral, anti-inflammatory. In the later phases, it's anti-inflammatory. It is an exceedingly safe drug. There's so much nonsense perpetuated. So humans have been given up to 10 times the recommended dose, 10 times. So the normal dose is 200 mics per kilogram. Patients have been given up to 10 times that, and in fact, even in higher doses, and are really well tolerated. The side effects are really related to usually the death of the parasite rather than the drug. So the FDA cautions against hepatitis. People make a big deal of hepatitis. Out of the 3.7 billion people that have been dosed with ivermectin, we're aware of one case report of hepatitis. So this is an exceedingly safe drug. So I'm going to present data from the Andrew Hill, who's been contracted by the WHO. So this is data that he has made publicly available. He has more updated data, which is even more impressive than this data, which you cannot question. So at this time, there were 18 trials, randomized controlled trials. So we're looking at randomized trials because that's what the ivory tower wants, with over 2,000 patients in a whole bunch of countries. And the patients were dosed usually 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, either once a day, or we'll see multiple doses. And what they did is they compared ivermectin versus standard of care. So half the patients got standard of care, the other half got ivermectin, which is exactly how you do a randomized controlled trial. The other studies use multiple dosing up to 5 days. And this is how we've come up with our 5-day treatment course, because it seems like 5 days is more effective than a single day. And again, these studies compared ivermectin versus ivermectin plus standard of care versus standard of care alone. So when you look at the mortality, and this table is now much bigger, significant mortality reduction, 2% versus 10%. This again is a meta-analysis which looks at the treatment effect. And if it's to the left of this line, it means it's effective, and it enables you to determine the confidence interval. So how confident are you about these results? So this is the confidence interval. So at worst, this data shows that at worst, ivermectin would reduce mortality by 40% at worst. At best, it will reduce it by 90%. So you can see that this is a highly effective drug in reducing mortality. So what is the problem, folks? Why the enormous resistance? This is looking at viral clearance. Now this is to the right, showing that with multiple dose versus single dose, multiple dose, you get much better viral clearance. So it decreases the number of dead people. You clear the virus much quicker. If you look at time to clinical recovery, now again on the other side, multiple dose versus single dose. So you can see those who took multiple dose, significantly greater recovery, but even with one dose, there was a significant recovery. So this drug reduces people dying. It improves clearance of the virus. It improves time to recovery. So you have to ask, what's the problem? And the cost, we should talk about the cost, which we will again. The WHO can buy a 12 milligram tablet of ivermectin for 2 cents. 2 cents. That's what they can get it for. So if you look at prophylaxis, again, it's profoundly effective. So these are studies looking at either healthcare workers or family contacts, again, showing a profound effect on preventing COVID infection. So again, you know, it's useful for treatment, it's useful for prophylaxis. And if you look at its safety, this is a review of the safety of ivermectin in humans. It's astonishing to me that people would not, this drug would not approve. It's approved for the use, it's FDA approved for the use of parasitic infections. It is a profoundly safe drug. is you can see negligible adverse reactions in humans. The only problem is if you're a collie dog. So if you're a collie dog, you have increased permeation into the brain, and it does cause sedation and it can cause coma. But we're not talking about treating collie dogs. It can be used in children as young as 6 months. The problem is we don't know its safety in pregnancy, particularly in the first trimester. So we don't recommend, unless this extraordinary circumstances like the woman's really sick, caution in pregnancy. And there are a number of drug-drug interactions that people need to be aware of. So getting back to controlling the pandemic. So I think the most important is the first line, is we need to inform and educate the public, and actually doctors as well. We need to provide the truth. There has been so much misinformation, and I think this misinformation has played a major role in the crisis we face ourselves. And I do think that there's some very sinister intentions that have intentionally misled the people. Public health measures obviously are important. This is a respiratory pathogen spread by droplets and aerosol. Despite all the hoo-hoo, we need to wear masks, we need to social distancing. And this doesn't mean you have to lock down and close the economy, but we should avoid large groups of people. I think locking down in itself has had serious consequences in terms of the economy, in terms of mental health, in terms of schooling. So, obviously you want to avoid these big groups of people. And then people who are at high risk, and in most people you can prophylax vitamin D, melatonin, vitamin C, quercetin. For people that have COVID, you need to treat them early. Don't wait. It's absurd to wait until they get really sick. So you want to treat them with ivermectin early. Unfortunately, in those patients who do progress, you want to treat them early with the MATH protocol. This idea of people waiting too late is a really bad idea, because then what happens is the disease becomes much more difficult to treat. And finally, vaccination. I think it's part of the solution. It's not the complete solution. We're not sure about the efficacy of the vaccination in terms of variants. We're not sure in terms of how long the immunity is enduring. While it seemed safe in the original trials, there are now over 500 deaths directly related to the vaccine. And indeed, sorry, hold on 1 second. Hey, Ed, I'm just on a webinar. Can you call me back in like 15 minutes? Thanks. So, sorry about that. My car just broke down today. So that was the dealership, just to add to my harassment. So as I was saying, we're not sure about the enduring effect. The safety has somewhat come into question. We know that there are a number of countries, including India, who will not give approval for the vaccine. I'm not sure about South Africa. I think it's questionable whether they're going to approve the vaccine. So it does have a role, but it's not the complete solution. And, I think, we have to be wary about the effectiveness of the vaccine against the variant strain. So with that, that's my overview. I'm going to stop sharing. And if any of you have any questions, I would be happy to entertain them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to hand back to Paul, who's going to run the question time.
Paul, I don't know if you could pick up the questions on your screen.
So,
can I just read them to you?
Oh, I do see. Okay, yeah, I see the chat. So I can go to the top if you want me to.
Sure, I have. They're in no particular order.
Maybe you can ask me
to read them.
Maybe you can ask me, and I'll try to respond.
Sure. Do people previously diagnosed positive retain any medium-term benefits? will their immune system react in the same way on a second infection? If they avoided a cytokine storm first time round, are they more or less likely to have the same response the second time around?
Yeah, so you ask a good question. So we know people, if you get exposed, you do have antibody response, which we know it lasts at least 6 months. There are people that get reinfections. It seemed like, at first it wasn't clear why, but it seemed that many of these reinfections are due to a variant strain, which is escapes from the first natural immunity. So generally speaking, if you've had COVID, you do have neutralizing antibodies, which last about 6 months. How long it provides protection, we don't know. What we do know is if somebody has had COVID, they then get vaccinated, they develop exceedingly high levels of neutralizing antibodies. And often they develop quite severe symptoms. So someone who's had COVID and then gets vaccinated can actually get quite sick with fever, malaise, muscle aches, and pains. So that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question. So, but generally, if you've had COVID, as far as we know, it will provide some degree of immunity. Now, whether you will have immunity against the variant, that remains a question, and probably less so.
Thank you. The next is from Hilton Mer. How should one consider the recent statement by the original manufacturer of ivermectin, Merck, that there is not enough evidence to support its use in treating COVID-19 patients?
Yeah, so I think you need to see where it comes from. It's an astonishing statement from a big pharma that has clear-cut financial interests. Merck has a number of antiviral drugs in the pipeline that they're working on. And I think this is an astonishingly immoral, unethical statement that they've made, because you can see from a financial point of view, are they going to promote a drug which is effective and safe and cheap? It's cheap. They're not going to make money from it. Or they're trying to promote new antivirals, much like remdesivir. So they have a whole host of antivirals. So this is completely immoral, but it goes back to how big pharma have influenced the dialogue. And this statement will come back and bite them. There's no question, because the data supporting the use of ivermectin is becoming so overwhelming that it cannot be ignored. It just cannot be ignored. We think there's enough data right now. The WHO is busy collecting data. So, at least by the end of March, I think there will be such overwhelming data that nobody in their right mind could make such a statement. So unfortunately, this is big pharma, and we know how big pharma controls Congress. It controls the NIH. It controls the New England Journal of Medicine. It controls Lancet. So New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet, which are considered the pillars of academia, have publicly admitted, they publicly have said that they are influenced to publish papers by big pharma. Big pharma influence them. So if the pillars of academia are influenced by big pharma, it's just open game for them.
Thank you. From Jeff Swartzberg, does ivermectin cause ocular side effects or conjunctival edema or blindness?
No, actually, it's used to treat river blindness. So onchocerciasis is a disease where you have parasitic infection of the eyeball, and ivermectin is probably it has almost eradicated river blindness. It's a very effective drug to treat river blindness. So it doesn't cause any ocular signs that we're aware of.
Thank you. How long after testing positive will a person then test negative? Airlines require a negative test to fly, but apparently one can stay positive for an extended period of time.
Yeah, so it's a stupid rule. And so the NIH used to say that people were infectious and needed to be isolated until they tested, 2 tests were negative. We now know that people can be positive for up to 70 days. 70 days, they can be PCR positive and yet do not have active replicating virus. So they're obviously being exceedingly cautious, but currently what the NIH says is that if you have had COVID and you've have had no fever for 10 days, you're no longer infectious. So the NIH has changed their guidance. They do not recommend repeat testing, because the results are meaningless. So they say that if you have had COVID and you no longer have a fever, you are no longer infectious.
Thank you. And then a question, is ivermectin, the drug reactions with ivermectin with Lyrica, trepoline, or the anti-uric acid drugs?
So there are a few drug-drug interactions. Most of them are with transplant drugs. There are a few with antifungal drugs. As far as I know, there's no interaction with colchicine or any other of that class of drugs.
Thank you. Professor Madlala has stated his 3 other reasons why Merck has issued their statement, which we can all read. I don't think you need to comment more on that. Hilton, in the South African context, the Minister of Health announced on Sunday that the AstraZeneca vaccine is not adequately effective against the South African mutation of COVID-19, and that the country would therefore not vaccinate health workers with it. Is it medically feasible to use both doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine on a patient?
So obviously,
when it becomes available.
Yeah, so obviously, if it's less effective, it would seem pointless to vaccinate people with a vaccine that is ineffective. So, the answer would be wouldn't make any sense.
Lars Forsman says, particularly after your presentation, if ivermectin has such important benefits, why have the applicable authorities not acknowledged this? I mean, it's the thrust of your presentation.
Yeah, so I mean, it's politics and it's money, and it's a real tragedy because thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people are dying at the expense of pharmaceutical companies profiteering. I don't know what else to say. It's astonishing. We know that 16 people on the NIH committee, the CDC committee, to approve remdesivir had direct financial ties to Gilead, the pharmaceutical company. We know that. We know that the NIH is deeply involved with Big Pharma. We know that Big Pharma are involved with the NIH in developing vaccines. We know that vaccines is a probably $100 billion industry. So it's not in the Big Pharma's interest to promote a drug which costs 2 cents. Let me say that again. The WHO has access to ivermectin at 2 cents. So this is not about saving lives and doing what's the right thing for humanity. This is about profiteering at the expense of other people's suffering and death.
Thanks. Mark Barnes has a very similar question. He remains confused about the diverse conclusions scientists have reached given logical development from the same set of factors input. Is it just money? Surely the integrity of the scientific community would prevail and we, the people, would get the facts.
Yeah, so you know what I mean? There are other people who, obviously there are a lot of hidden agendas. Tess Lowry, who was also an ex-South African from London, has done an independent review. So she completely independently has reviewed the data and has come to the same conclusion. Surprisingly, Andrew Hill from the WHO, and we're not sure about the motivations of the WHO has come to the same conclusion. There are a few meta-analysis sites on the web that basically show the exact same data. There's COVID meta-analysis. There are a whole bunch of sites. They all show the same data. So I don't think there's any conflict in the data. What the conflict has been is people have said the quality of the data is bad. So unfortunately, there's this xenophobic attitude. If it doesn't come from the US or it doesn't come from the UK, that these are substandard investigators that have cheated, which obviously is racist and xenophobic and unacceptable. So, you know, the people have criticized the studies from Egypt, from Iran, from Bangladesh, from South America, saying these are substandard studies. I mean, these are dedicated clinicians who are doing their best in difficult circumstances. And what's interesting is that all the studies line up. They all show exactly the same thing. So you can look at epidemiological data. There are certain parts of the world where in certain provinces, they've just handed out ivermectin, particularly in Peru. In 8 provinces in Peru, they just handed out ivermectin. Immediately after doing that, the deaths in those provinces went down as compared to adjoining provinces. So, you know what, we think the data is overwhelming. And, you know, you have to look at the totality of the evidence. You know, you don't look at one study. You know, when a jury looks at a case, they look at the totality of the evidence. So we think there's preclinical data, there's epidemiological data, there's pre and post exposure data, there's data in early treatment and late treatment. All of these studies line up and show a clinical benefit. And even if there was some doubt, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a cheap drug. There's no question of doubt. This drug is more effective than remdesivir. If you look at remdesivir, remdesivir does not reduce the risk of dying, yet remdesivir is approved, while ivermectin, which has been shown to reduce mortality, we could argue about the strength of the evidence, is not approved because it's a cheap drug. And it's very safe. It's very safe. So to discount the fact that there's sinister things going on, I think would be naive.
One gets a strong sense of your frustration with this, particularly that you know that you've put yourselves online to promote what you're saying, and I think it's fantastic. Brian Meissen asked, one of your early graphs, why does the blue band diverge over time, and does this suggest that some people have long-lasting symptoms?
So yeah, so there is this long hauler syndrome. So, you know, people have focused on acute infection, but it appears that, you know, maybe 60 to 70% of people have COVID, never totally recover, particularly more elderly people. They develop the long haulers or the post-COVID. And the symptoms can vary, but people can be very disabling. It interferes with the quality of life. It interferes with the ability to go back to work. These people have fatigue, tiredness, headaches, muscle pains, chest pain. So while some people do recover, many go on to develop this post-COVID syndrome. And we don't have a really good handle how to treat it. So there is one study, and obviously it's only one study, so one has to be cautious on the use of ivermectin in patients with post-COVID, which seem to be of some success. There is some data on the use of steroids. I think the post-COVID syndrome is an important one which needs to be further investigated, and people haven't paid much attention.
Thank you. And it's an important question for this country. In our country, people are using veterinary ivermectin injections by mouth or as a skin lotion, etc. Is this dangerous? And is the quality used critical?
So obviously that's an important question, and obviously we officially can't endorse the use of veterinary medicines because, you know, clearly you want to use human grade ivermectin. What I can say though is that the ivermectin for injection is pretty pure. So people have taken it with good results, and there is actually a study in patients with river blindness in whom they use veterinary grade ivermectin. So, you know, unfortunately, people will do what they have to do because when someone is sick and dying, and you can understand why they do that. So, you know, people must do what they need to do. I think that the injectable form is of a higher purity than the paste.
For those who have lingering symptoms, you've answered that question to maybe continue taking the ivermectin. If in the later stages of COVID, some people get inflammation from the dead virus, does this have an impact on the vaccine, which injects a bit of the COVID into the body? For example, the AstraZeneca vaccine.
So what happens is you have an immune response to the dead virus. So what then happens is with all the vaccines, you're giving pieces of virus. So the host is going to respond to their immunologically to that virus. So you're going to get a much heightened immune response. So people, post-COVID people and people who've had COVID who get the vaccine, without question, will get a heightened immune response to the vaccine.
There's quite a provocative question by Paul Harris. No ways 3.7 billion people have taken ivermectin. Maybe 3.7 billion doses.
Yes, maybe you're right, 3 billion doses. We don't know exactly. We know the WHO have had mass distribution plans throughout most of Africa and Asia in distributing ivermectin. So the number of actual people, we don't know, but clearly it's in the millions to billions. We know that at least 3.7 billion doses have been distributed. We know it's had a really big impact in terms of filariasis and river blindness. The actual number is difficult to know because of mass distribution. So in many countries, it's being mass distributed. What is fascinating is people have looked at COVID in countries where there has been mass distribution of ivermectin versus not. And those countries that have had large mass distribution programs have significantly less COVID. So it is kind of a collateral effect of COVID, of ivermectin distribution.
There's probably a study in South Africa. I don't know any farmer that's not taking ivermectin. So maybe we've got a study of our own in that space.
Yes.
In South Africa, we have no political or economic interest to downplay any drug. But SAFRA says, that's the Drug Medicine Control Council, says that there has not been sufficiently large studies to prove the effectiveness of ivermectin. How big are these studies, and do you have concern that the samples are too small from the evidence that you're presenting, I presume?
Yeah, so, you know, the studies are small. You know, the biggest one is maybe 400 patients. But what I can tell you is there's a very well done study from Israel, which is regarded as a first world country, showing dramatic effects. There are studies now coming with 700 patients, coming out 3,000 patients. So these are studies that are coming out right now. Dr. Hill has the data. So the study, the number of patients and the size of the studies and the quality is improving. You know, size doesn't always mean everything. You know, it's a well-done study. My understanding from the study done in Israel, it was impeccably done, you know, under the best conditions, a randomized, double-blind study. And my understanding, it showed dramatic effects. So I think we are going to see down the road more studies, more data, And I think it's going to come to the point where it becomes undeniable that one cannot dispute the fact that this drug can have a major influence in COVID-19.
Thank you. There's a similar question. Is the animal version of ivermectin the same as the human version? I think you've answered that.
Yeah, so the molecule is the same. It's ivermectin. The only difference may be the purity of the ivermectin molecules. So in some of the veterinary products, there may be some contaminants.
I'm sorry, I just want to come in here, Paul, a sec. There's a question of, if you are taking ivermectin prophylactically, how long should one continue taking it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we now recommend taking it every 2 weeks. And theoretically, you should take it as long as you have a high risk of getting COVID. So we think it's safe long-term. There's a study out of Paris where they gave ivermectin daily. They gave it daily in very high doses, and it proved to be very safe. In Argentina, they gave it weekly for 4 months. So we would say that it's a risk benefit. So as long as you're at high risk, you should take it. If you're at less risk, then take the vitamin D, the vitamin C, the melatonin, and when you're then at high risk, take the ivermectin.
Thank you. When Michelle has been advised from a seller of ivermectin that dosages for prophylaxis is 6 milligrams per day, every second day for 1 week, and then 1 week off for a 60-kilogram person. And is this sufficient?
Yeah, so we don't recommend that dose. So the doses that are generally used, so ideally you need to weight base it because it's a highly lipophilic molecule that goes to adipose tissue. So that obese people need to take a higher dose. So we recommend 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, which works out in a 70-kilogram person to about 12 milligrams. If you're a little bit more overweight, maybe 18 milligrams. There are some people that make it. So with the mass distribution, it's more difficult to weigh people. So they just use a fixed dose. But in terms of prophylaxis, it's 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, day 1, day 3, and then every 2 weeks. So, and that works out at about 12 milligram tablet if you're 70 kilograms, or if you weigh 80 or more, maybe 18 milligrams.
Perhaps the last question, or maybe the second last question, from Paul Harris. The big pharma conspiracy theories can't be substantiated. In movies, maybe. Do we really have predominantly evil people sitting on their boards and their committees? Companies subjected to intense public scrutiny may unnecessarily undermine a good story in my mind. Paul, have I lost you, or you think you've answered that question?
Now, will you unmute yourself? Sorry, Doctor.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry, I'm not sure how that happened. So we do know that money talks, and we do know that almost every single pharmaceutical company has faced fines for illegal behavior, promoting drugs that don't work, false advertising. We know that big pharma will sell drugs that don't work to make a profit. So their goals are not humanitarian. Their goals are to make money. And they're accountable to their stockholders, not to the patients. I think it's very difficult to discount the effect big pharma have. Big pharma contribute more in money to Congress than any other industry. So big pharma have enormous influence. What you may not know is that there are only 2 countries in the world that have direct consumer advertising. So on TV here, we see pharma advertising for prescription medications. So they have enormous influence. The other country is New Zealand, but they do not allow prescription medication. So we're the only country in the world that Big Pharma can directly advertise complicated pharmaceutical agents directly to the public. And that has a major influence on the news media, TV, in general. So Big Pharma have enormous control. And, obviously, if I say this, I have a big target on my back because they don't like this. But we have personal experience of Big Pharma manipulating stuff to illegally promote their drug. They're interested in selling their drug. Whether it works or not is irrelevant. They're there to make money.
Paul, thank you very much. Paul Harris, do you want to comment on that? I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, no, I hear this, but I think it undermines a really good story to characterize people, and it's people. I mean, people on boards and subcommittees and ethical committees and all that is evil people. Yeah, I don't think that's always the case. I hear exactly what you say about the profits are important, but at the same time, they do R&D. They spend massive amounts on R&D, and at the end of the day, you have to get some return. But I really don't think that they're motivated with evil intent. I think that was the point that I wanted to.
So just to respond, they give this argument about how much they spend on research and development. They spend significantly more on advertising, maybe 10 to 20 more time-fold on advertising than they do on research and development. And one just has to look at the Merck statement to realize the extent of the maleficence that's going on. Because clearly the Merck statement has nothing to do with science and with facts. And I think it speaks for itself.
Thank you. I'd like to...
Sorry,
Sorry, Paul.
Sorry?
Yes.
No, I just thought that this kind of discussion is really perhaps for another session.
Yes, I'd like to bring in Professor Nathi Mdadle. If you'd unmute yourself. Professor Mdadle is from the Dr. George McCurry Academic Hospital. And he, I think, is involved in the current treatment in South Africa. And I think he's got a few things he'd like to say.
Sure.
Professor?
Thanks, Ollie. I think, first of all, to just thank Paul for such a great presentation, putting out all the evidence that's available out there. And just really sharing something that a lot of us have been experiencing. So it's strange that in spite of everything that's available and that we've all heard about, the gravitation of people is still towards their original viewpoints. I came across the work that Paul has shared from about December last year. And out of desperation, really, because of the high numbers of deaths that we are seeing amongst young people with the new strain in South Africa. And I've sort of been wondering, why is this drug not being allowed? And what Paul touches on about the politics, when I first started talking about it in groups where sort of the big politicos or even the Minister of Health is on, I was actually called political for bringing up the subject of Ivermectin. And I actually wondered, why would somebody label a desperate call by a frontline physician to say, let us treat patients. These people will die, whether we give them Ivermectin or not, but there's a chance that they will survive if we give them based on the available data. And why would people stand in the way of that? And in a forum like that, to then be called, you are pushing political statements, actually made me wonder that obviously there's something more to this than what meets the eye. And I came across Andrew Hill's study as well. Actually, somebody from the WHO sent me his presentation he had made to the WHO before it got published. And I looked at the data and I said to myself, there is enough evidence to say this actually works. And as Paul has said, progressively and with more upcoming data, the evidence is clear. Andrew Hill has said himself, the chances that his studies or his meta-analysis findings are incorrect are 5,000 to 1. Now, why would anybody not give a medication that has that big an odds ratio of success to somebody who is desperate and is in a bad way. So I think, I mean, in totality, I'm happy with Paul's talk today. And I hope that actually people listen. Just listen with a careful ear. I don't think Paul's got any gain for advertising ivermectin. I do not have any gain for advertising ivermectin. My only attempt is to save as many people as I can. Thanks, Solly.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you for that, because you bring some really important points. So, you know, myself and my colleagues, we have no vested interest. People think, you know, we're making money from this. You know, this costs an enormous amount of time and effort, but we're doing this because we have a social responsibility to do this. That's all we do. We're not going to make money on this cheap drug, and it should not be a political thing. I agree with you 100%. We should look at the science and the facts. It has nothing to do with politics. It's not to do with right wing or left wing or conservative or liberal. We should look at the science. We should focus on the science. And, you know, obviously nobody is going to make money from this. You know, we have no vested interest.
Thank you. Is there anyone else, particularly from the medical field, who want to come in and ask a question? Please just unmute yourself and do so. Or anyone else who wants to ask a question quickly.
Solly, hi. Maybe it's controversial, but you speak about it and it sounds very convincing. And I just want to know, if one wants to get hold of ivermectin, is it available in South Africa, and where would one get hold of it?
So I can tell you it is available. The pills, the human pills, are available in South Africa. They're obviously being brought in on the black market. And you can get hold of me if you want, and I can put you in the right direction.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
Can I ask a question? Chris
Sure,
Farley.
Yes.
Could I ask Dr. Marik, are you taking prophylactic ivermectin, sir?
Yes, so it's a good question. So the answer is yes. I have been vaccinated. I did debate whether I should take the vaccine. I have been vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine because I believe in the science rather than the politics. But last week I had to travel to my family and I'm not sure about the protection. So I took 12 milligrams of ivermectin before I left. So for the vaccine, I took ivermectin, and now when I consider myself at high risk, I take ivermectin.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I have to go.
Okay, last question, maybe. I'm just opening it up quickly.
Sorry, last question. Can I just ask something? Doctor, thanks very much for a great presentation. Can I just ask, the biggest criticism of taking ivermectin is, as you've pointed out, people saying lack of science. In the context of all the work that's been done to develop the vaccines, would you say that the ivermectin discussion as it relates to work done is greater or equal to a vaccine, and therefore if you prepare to take a vaccine, you should have no issue taking ivermectin?
So no, obviously the vaccine studies were very large randomized controlled trials. So, you know, these were 30,000 patients, so they were really well conducted. What's interesting is, despite the fact that they appeared safe in post-marketing use, the vaccines have had significantly more side effects than with the original studies. So, you know, I don't think you can compare them, you know, because these were very big studies in which enormous amounts of money were spent to do very big studies. You know, to do a study on ivermectin, who's going to put up the money? So that's the problem. So there is a difference in the quality. There's no question. The vaccine studies were well done, randomized double-blind studies. But you know, I think it doesn't undermine the fact that we have, you know, 20 going on 25 smaller randomized controlled trials with ivermectin, and I think the quality of the studies is getting better with time.
Thank you, Doctor. And
well, I just got one question. So can you find out where can I buy shares in ivermectin?
Thank you. Doctor, before we go, thank you, Professor, so much for your time. I just want to say that I feel particularly proud that an ex-South African, a doctor who qualified in South Africa, is at your level and has done such amazing work. Thank you very, very much. And on behalf of our group, I would just like to give you if people could just unmute themselves and a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, what I would say is that
Thank you.
this is a story that's ongoing, and the final chapter hasn't been written yet.
Good. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Paul.
Can you give us your email address if we've got other questions, please? Prof?
Everything must come through me.
Why don't you send them to Sonny? He can send them to me.
Good.
Did you record the meeting?
Thank you, Hank.
Thank you very much, guys.
So, thank you.
Okay.
Bye. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.